So Robert Moffitt, co-author, frequently just mentioned, will be commenting, making complimentary comments, I would assume, not identical. Yes.
Yeah, right.
Complimentary, spelled with an E.
Yeah, let's make sure how that's spelled. Okay, I first want to say that I want to echo a lot of the commentaries that have been made in other forums on the Mirrlees report, one of which is that it's really an extremely useful volume, and I'm not really referring to the individual regional papers, which are good, but the 7 or 8 chapters in the kind of summary, which go through a lot of the basics of tax policy and the conclusions that economists have reached in non-technical terms. And so I really, there's nothing like that around, and I highly commend it. On Richard's paper and the labor supply work behind that, I also want to say that's the best compilation of what we know empirically that's around, and goes much beyond actually what the literature is in terms of trying to identify the subgroups where elasticities are high and where they aren't high. I don't know anything like that either, so that is great. One may not always agree with their conclusions, but still, it's very comprehensive. So anyway, I'm going to talk about 2 things, and maybe I made a mistake of trying to pick 2, because there are so many issues here. You could talk all day about all of them. So one of them is transfer program design, which Mike just alluded to a little bit, and that's something I happen to have worked on a lot, so I have some opinions on that. So the other one is I'm going to comment on Mirrlees' report, and actually that's going to touch on a couple of things that Hendrik talked about. So I'll try to move through these. So the transfer program design, and I'm going to say a lot of this is going to be familiar to people who already work on this. The traditional issues, you want to keep tax rates and benefits low. That goes back here, we're in Chicago, so I've got to mention the negative income tax, and Milton Friedman, a lot of other people wanted to do that. And I think everybody should have universal agreement on that one. But the problem is that lower tax rates, holding the guarantee, and I'm going to use all these language here. The guarantee is the amount that you receive if you don't work at all. The tax rate is the amount by which benefits are reduced for each extra dollar of earnings. Problem is, if you lower the tax rate to get more work incentives, then you're going to increase expenditure, and you've got to pay for that somehow, and therefore you're going to have to raise taxes somewhere else to holding tax revenues fixed. And if you go to the paper that was in the background paper for the Mirrlees report, it's by Brewer, Sayas, and Shepard, they said, okay, you got to do that. And they have a rather detailed list of all the places they found in the tax code where it said, here we're going to get these guys, and they're going to have to pay for this. And roughly speaking, they wanted to cut the child benefit, which goes to a lot of higher income families, and they wanted to just raise rates. So I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen a lot of this happen, is because somebody has to pay for it. Less recognized by many economists, but Mike just referred to it, much less general public. If you actually reduce that marginal rate down the bottom, you actually get some labor supply reductions from the kind of people slightly higher up in the income distribution. You bring more people on the program, and they reduce their labor supply. I wrote a paper actually for Milton Friedman's 90th birthday conference, which was published in 2003, which reviewed the evidence on what the net effect is from the increase in labor supply at the bottom and the decrease at the slightly higher up. If you have a negative income tax, reduce marginal rates, they kind of cancel each other out. There was zero average impact. Now, that came from NIT data as well as some econometric evidence. So I'm not going to go through that. And that's true of earning subsidies too. Our earning subsidies have to be phased out. And if you phase them out, you're going to get labor supply reductions. And in fact, if you look at the data on the research on the EITC, my reading is exactly that. You get some increases in labor supply at the bottom, and you get decreases in labor supply of the people in the phase-out range. So you can't get around this problem. And I should say there's nothing wrong with Mirrlees' optimal tax model in this respect. It's all in there. It's just that the Mirrlees tax model is very general, and it doesn't focus on the low-income population. You're moving the tax rates around the whole income distribution, looking for the optimal point. So it doesn't focus on this issue that when you're lowering the marginal tax rate at the bottom, you're increasing the rates slightly higher up in the district, not the very top, but also at the just a little bit higher up. And for me, you know, I'm kind of a policy guy out there talking to people. My view is that that's not the way people think about it. They think about a low-income population down there, and let's say $30,000 and below in the U.S., just to pick a number, and they're talking about how to design a program and who are going to be the winners and losers within that category. And a net income tax has some winners and losers in that category if you reduce the rates. Same way with EITC, which is basically a regressive, in its lower regions, a regressive tax. And you help people who are better off slightly before you start taking it away. So my preference is to look at that population. So just as an approach, to look at the lower income population, and as just a way to approach the problem, hold welfare expenditure fixed. And if you hold welfare expenditure fixed, now of course that has a choice variable, and I'm sure the total amount you want to give to the low income population is a function of how you're giving it to them. So they can't be completely separated, but just for the sake of analyzing the problem, hold welfare expenditure. And if you do that, then we lower the tax rate, you've got to lower the guarantee at the same time. And in fact, that's what Milton Friedman proposed. If you go back to 1962, his negative income tax wanted to, they were in the U.S. Welfare system, he proposed eliminating a bunch of programs and consolidating them, the net effect of which was to lower G as well as lower T. Now, this is the basic trade-off that I see between the G and the T. That's why I think that's the key thing to focus on. And I think it's very relevant to the Mirrlees report, because the Mirrlees report is focused on UK. And if you look at Europe and the UK and compare it to the US, the basic difference is Europe and the UK have these very high Gs and very high Ts. So they give you a lot of money if you don't work, and they really tax the hell out of it. And over here, we have very low Gs. And today, and it wasn't always the case, today we have very low Ts. Richard showed some diagrams up there. The tax rate is negative, okay? For even if you're receiving all these programs, it's negative over that first range. You're getting a subsidy today, mainly because of the EITC, and which is, can be up to a 40% subsidy on your earnings. So we're a pretty low, and I can go through all the programs, food stamps, TANF, they're all low tax rate now, especially when you take out deductions that they have. So, it's another issue, but I think we're really low tax right now. But we have low guarantees. We have no cash program anymore for people not to work, period, without any other condition. But just, if you're not working, here's some cash. We have zero programs like that. So the G is not high. We have a lot of special need programs for G. So anyway, that's my take on it. And I only want to say that I think when you focus on that, the trade-off between G and T, you're into this. I don't know what society wants to decide. That's up to them, where they want to distribute that money among different segments of the poor. That's a social decision, but it's a conundrum, and you just can't help some people without making other people worse. And certainly labor supply elasticity should play a role in making that decision, as well as welfare weights and the distribution of income, all the things that Hendrik mentioned. But that's why I'm actually partial on, and a few other people are, to tagging programs. And in this context, that's a work requirement. And Milton Friedman hated work requirements because he hated anything that had a kind of that wasn't based just on income. He hated all the deductions. He didn't talk about work requirements. He hated all the deductions. Just have a simple income rule. And he would not have liked work requirements because those distinguish between people who deserve, quote, deserving and undeserving people. And to me, it's just a signal versus noise question. You really want to know what their true ability is, their true market wage, how accurately you can estimate that. If you can estimate it halfway decently, then you can just take the people who have low market wages and you say, okay, those are the people we want to give a high G to, and the people who have a low, you estimate to have a low market wage, make work requirements. You're not going to get any money unless you work a certain amount. And you, as Akerlof pointed out, you can have a lot of gains from that because you can then give more money to certain kinds of people. You can actually raise the G for some, and because you're lowering it for others, and you're not faced with this problem that you have to give G to everybody regardless of what we think their true ability is. So I like it, but and I actually also mentioned the Mirrlees report has a great discussion of tagging, that it wasn't part of their proposals, but they have a very nice discussion of the pros and cons of tagging. If you want to just get an introduction to that, you haven't had it. Okay, so what about the Mirrlees report? I'm glad Hendrik talked about that because when I read it, I said, on the stuff that Ramsey, there's another Cambridge Don lurking, behind the Mirrlees Cambridge Don. And, and instead of using excise taxes, which is what Ramsey was about, you look for the inelastic product demand to lay all your heavy taxes on. Here we're talking about labor income taxation. And so I got to admit, I worry about it a little bit, but mostly for political reasons. I maybe disagree here and there on where the elasticities are big and where they're small, but actually I kind of agree with most of it. The only place where I would say that I think, and there's been a lot of commentary on the Mirrlees report about the higher income groups. And, you know, I think the Mirrlees report, that's not where they're really putting their attention. And a lot of people over in the US right now are putting their attention on that one. So in terms of, maybe that's a difference in the UK and the US, but from the US point of view, there's not as much on the higher income groups as, and that was not, certainly Richard was coming out talking about life cycle taxation more than, you know, taxing higher income groups, but it's in there. So, but anyway, the I think I have to admit I'm a little worried about it. So I just listed 4 groups here that Richard mentioned where elasticities he thinks are higher, and this is a simplification. He made much more nuanced findings based upon education and family type and things like that. That's what I'm talking about here. And I kind of agree with these. I wasn't completely clear from the write-up exactly what kind of tax is being proposed here. If it's just age dependent, I can understand that. If you're basing it upon whether the woman just had a birth, you know, within the 6 months, that's a different matter. If you're basing it upon when you leave school, you know, whether you're in school or out of school, that's a different matter. If you're basing it when you're retired or not retired, that's a different matter. I would be much more nervous about changing the tax code when you leave school, when you retire, and actually even probably, you know, when you have your kid. So if it's just age, that's different. I go through here. Basically, I really don't agree with. I did disagree with much of that at all. High earners, like I said, I think in the U.S., I think we need more attention to that. My view, I actually did a paper on this with a guy named Mark Wilhelm a while ago on taxation of the rich, is that it is all at the, as I think most people agree now, the margin for the high earners is at the earnings margin, the income margin, not the hours margin. I won't bother really showing the graph, but the data I looked at back around the mid-1980s when the Tax Reform Act 1986 was occurring, guys in the top 10% or top 5% were working about 3,000 hours a year, $3,000 to $4,000 a year. You're not going to get them to work 5,000 by, you know, lowering the tax rates. So that's not the margin. But if you look at if you just do a Feldstein and look at the response of earnings to the TRA 86 by marginal tax rate bracket, basically nobody responded to that except the top. There's this big jump at the top 10%. And I have some graphs here. So I think there's really something there. Again, the Mirrlees report, unless I'm wrong here, tends to emphasize the problems of tax evasion and changing your composition of income as opposed to the quote-unquote real things. And maybe some other people here are more experts on that literature now and where it's come down, because I'd like, maybe Henrik probably knows that literature and has an opinion on whether it's real or not. I'd like to hear his view on that. But in any case, we're all scholars here, so if you want to apply a Ramsey rule, and of course there are a lot of issues with Ramsey, but if you want to just start lowering taxes for specific groups that you think have high labor supply elasticities, I mean, we're trying to be practical here. I'm a little nervous about that. I'm a little nervous about opening up to Congress, saying, okay, we're going to favor some people here, and we're going to pick them out on the basis of our labor supply elasticities, and letting them start favoring certain groups in that way. I don't think history is very favorable in what happens when that's the case. And I don't think actually labor supply elasticities is the basis for most of the tax code that's there, including, I should say, the EITC. We all like the EITC because it has work incentives at the bottom. That's not why the Congress passed the EITC. It's not why President Clinton expanded it. The justification of that was that there were people who were working full-time, so-called working poor, who had pretty high earnings, and we want to help them out. All these programs that only gave money to people who weren't working weren't helping the working poor at all. The working poor, so it's an argument about social welfare weights. It was not an argument about work incentives. And in fact, if you look at the literature on the EITC, okay, you get maybe 1 or 2%, 3% increases in labor supply. That's not going to justify the billions of dollars you're spending on the EITC. It's a redistributional program and not I'm just making a point about what Congress, why they do things. And other than reducing marginal rates at the top, which is usually justified by work incentives, I don't think anything else, much of anything else I can think of really is made for that reason. There are some other people who are more astute political analysts than I am here, but I'd like to hear their views on that. So I'm nervous about the recommendations here. At first glance, I kind of lean toward uniform taxation and not starting to play with the tax code. But that is not a recommendation based upon the pure formulas for it, which we conduct as academics. Anyway, so that's enough. Let me stop there.